Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics like wealth creation strategies, investment principles, creating passive income, paying off your debt faster, and much, much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I am Billy and I'm joined by my co-host,
Andrew. Bills, how you going? Back again for another podcast.
Yeah, Andrew, it is. We are back again for another podcast, and I am good, and it's good to be in Melbourne because the sun is shining. And
for a short period of time.
Took me a while to get that out for probably 2 days, and then I think it's going to rain on the weekend.
Exactly
so
right.
We'll wait and see. But all good, mate. What about you?
All's going very well. And we're here with another interesting and juicy topic. And I was actually just saying to you before, I can't believe that we haven't spoken about this earlier.
It's funny, when we're coming up with the content to talk about, you're absolutely right. It's racking our brains going, okay, what's relevant at that particular point in time? What haven't we spoken about? And really for us, it's how do we get more and more value across to our listeners and our viewers? And you're right. I don't know how we've missed this one, but it's really relevant, and I think it's going to be quite an interesting chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us, what are we talking about, Bills?
We're talking about negative gearing.
Negative gearing. You hear this all the time.
That's it. Andrew, tell us, what's negative gearing?
Negative gearing is essentially making a cash flow loss on a property. Is usually what a negative gearing is. So the expenses that you have and accumulate with your property throughout the year are greater than the income that you're getting in from that property. Sounds a little bit crazy. Sounds like, why the hell would I do that? But it's mainly utilized for a tax purpose. So people utilize negative gearing in order to be able to, number one, you purchase a property, you start receiving rental income from it. The interest associated with the loan, all of the expenses are tax deductible. The income, so the rental income that you're receiving, is actually less than what all of those expenses are. So you're making a loss from an income perspective, which means that when you're doing your tax return, you're getting a better tax return because you're making an investment loss. But what you're relying on is that property increasing in value, so that even though every year you're getting a tax deduction for the property, and even though it's a tax effective strategy, you're still building wealth because the property is going up in value, and you don't actually pay any tax on that until you eventually sell the property and pay capital gains tax in the future.
Right, so that's the end of the podcast.
Yep,
Just basically explain what negative gearing was, gave you an example. No, we might actually use a worked example of this because I reckon that would be probably easiest. Let's assume you buy an investment property. We don't actually need to talk about the price. We'll use cash flow as an example. Say you rent it out for $500 a week, so that's $25,000 a year. And say the expenses, so the interest, the running costs, everything associated with that property is $30,000 a year. So from a cash flow differential, you're talking about being out of pocket $5,000.
Yep.
So in that instance, you're negatively geared with that property. That $5,000 loss, we can then add that to your assessable income. Let's just say, for argument's sake, your gross income is $100,000. You'd add that $5,000 loss onto your $100,000, so you'd get taxed at $95,000 rather than $100.
Correct.
So from a cash flow perspective, you're out of pocket. From a taxation perspective, there is some benefit there because the idea is the larger the loss, the more money you'll get back at tax time. And then the benefit of the other strategy, the benefit of this strategy as well too, is you're kind of negatively holding onto a property from a cash flow perspective. So it's costing you money each week, each month, each year. But the idea is over time, the property value will go up. You're not paying capital gains tax until you sell the property, but you're really getting the benefit of the asset value going up over time, but you're getting the taxation benefit each year.
Yeah, exactly right. So it's a tax effective means for a wealth creation strategy.
Yep.
So you're building wealth, you're accumulating assets, and you're getting a tax deduction for it along the way. Yep. On the surface, amazing. Perfect. Great strategy.
I'm sure we're going to get into that.
But look, we'll get into some of the things some of the real benefits within it, which I think we've already touched on, is ultimately the tax benefits associated with it. But we'll get on to, it's not right for everyone. It's right for some people. But the amount of times that we've sat in front of clients that are just so focused on, I need to purchase a property. I need a negatively geared property because my accountant said that I'm paying too much tax, and it's just completely the wrong strategy for them. It's crazy.
I mean, on paper, all else being equal, the strategy works and makes sense, and hundreds of thousands of Australians have grown their wealth using this method, and it's a strategy that we deploy day in, day out for the right types of clients. But there's a few things that you need to look at, and we'll talk about interest rates. I guess that's probably the first thing.
Yeah.
Sleep test is always another one. From a financial planning aspect, making sure that we've got all of the right strategies, emergency funds, cash flow management structure, your insurance is in place, all of that sort of stuff. We'll get into that, but it's interesting that the throwaway is just, I've got a tax problem, I'll go and buy a property and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Sure, no worries. Go and sign it on the dotted line for a $500,000 mortgage. I don't think it's that straightforward these days, especially in an interest rate environment that's increasing. So maybe we'll talk about interest rates.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, that's something that really impacts this strategy. So in an environment where interest rates are very cheap, it does make it more difficult to purchase a negatively geared property. So, you consider some of the home loan rates that we were seeing, start of this year, that home loan rates were starting with a 1, trying to negatively gear a property when most of the time, when you're deploying a strategy like this, the biggest expense and the biggest thing that's going to contribute to whether you can negatively gear a property is the interest rates, the interest that you're paying on your loan. So when interest rates are very, very cheap, it does mean that being able to deploy this strategy is far more difficult, and utilizing, and even if you do negatively gear a property, it's going to be negatively geared very slightly. So, you're probably only getting a minimal tax benefit at the end of it as well.
I always find this whole concept very interesting, and I understand the maths behind it, right? There is kind of no other situation, and it's because of our tax structure in Australia, but there's no other situation where I'd actually go into an investment kind of hoping to lose money or being in a negative cash flow or a negative, negative cash flow position. That wouldn't happen in any other circumstance. Yeah. It'd just be a bad investment. You wouldn't go near it.
Yeah.
Plus, signing on the dotted line for hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt on the hope that the property is going to be worth more in a decade or 2 decades time, which, we'll make an assumption that that's going to hold true. But I always find it really challenging to get my head around it, even though I understand the maths completely and the strategy completely. I always find it difficult to wrap my head around.
Yeah, and I think it's just a testament as well as to people's comfort levels around investing in property. You tell people that you're going to make a guaranteed loss on the share market every year, but it's expected to increase at a future point in time, and you're going to get your money back when you sell it in 15 years, and most people look at you like you're crazy. No. But when it's a property asset, I think people just really feel far more comfortable with it, at least in our experience, and they're quite they react differently to what they would in another asset class.
Yeah, and I think it's just that, I will say that fascination with property.
Yeah.
It's just property, I think, and it allows a certain level of comfort. Probably that appetite and that attitude is changing at the moment because interest rates are increasing, and it seems like every 2 seconds you're getting a letter from your bank saying, yep, there's another increase. I got one yesterday, so nice and fresh in my mind.
Like they're just constantly in the mail.
They are, and because Australia Post takes a little while to deliver, it's kind of like you get one and it's like the next one's around the corner.
Yeah.
It's like, so it seems like they're coming through all the time, but whether or not that appetite changes of late because of the environment that we're in, I think that might be the case.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the other thing too is cash flow play. Sure, no worries, I understand that. If we're in an environment like we are now where rental stock is tight and the cost of renting a property is going up, then maybe that makes your property less negatively geared or even pushes it into positively geared territory. But by its very nature, if you pay a loan back on principal and interest, which is what we prefer to do all of the time, at some particular point, you're going to reach a crossover where it won't be negatively geared.
Yeah.
You're going to have cash coming in. Maybe you put that into the loan as extra repayments to pay it down faster. But this thing would only work over the life of, say, the strategy if you're on an interest-only loan for the entire time.
Yeah, correct. And look, one of the other benefits or one of the other strategies that you can deploy in order to have a negatively geared property and not necessarily be impacted from a cash flow perspective is new builds. So properties that you purchase that are new builds as opposed to an existing property, you can depreciate the value of the property. Now, depreciation is not an expense that you pay. You're not actually paying for any depreciation. So it's going to show up on your tax return as an expense because it's something that you're on paper incurring, but in reality you're not actually paying any additional money. So one of the things that people can do in order to be able to deploy this strategy without it actually impacting their cash flow at the end of the day is essentially purchasing a property that's a new build in order to be able to claim the depreciation on it.
A few things to consider in that one, whether or not that then meets the strategy in terms of the growth aspirations that you want, because if it is a new build, maybe there's a lot of stock around that area as well too. So your growth in that particular, area, maybe there's an availability of land, which means it's not as scarce, which means your capital growth may not be as good. A lot of things to consider.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah, plenty of things to consider.
Yep. Expenses for the property, obviously from a interest perspective, that then forms part of the expenses that are going out.
Yep.
What about things like agents' fees? What about things like maintenance?
Yep.
Does that all add up to the
all counts towards the expense column? Yeah. So your maintenance fees, your agent fees, all of that stuff is all going to impact from an expense side of things, and is all going to effectively be a tax deduction against the income. So yeah. Absolutely.
Yep. Interesting enough, because in any other circumstance, you'd be trying to drive your expenses down as much as you can.
Yeah.
Whereas in this instance, maybe you don't pay as much attention because you want the negatively geared,
or
you want the negative cash flow.
This is always the conundrum that I'm in, and sort of probably the next point in the conversation is I kind of don't get it sometimes, and what I mean by that is, let's talk about the rental income. You allude to it earlier. And, some people, they try to keep the rent down so that it's a more negatively geared property. Doesn't make sense to me. Why would you, if you consider a scenario where you can lose $1,000 and then claim, 37% back on it because it's negatively geared by $1,000 a year and you're on a 37% tax bracket, would you rather lose $1,000 and get $375 back? Or would you rather make $1,000 and pay tax on that $1,000 and have $675 in your bank account? You'd rather, positively gear an asset. You'd rather have money coming in, pay the tax on it as a necessary consequence, but you're still net better off than trying to lose money in order to be able to claim a tax deduction.
I'll give you a worked example, because even before I was a financial planner and when I was young, a long time ago, by the way. I just thought I'd jump in and
I did
and preempt that. Before you were born, Andrew, right? No, it was the property spruiking was rife. Apartments going up, and the narrative would be something like this: there'd be these fancy spreadsheets, and it's for $50 a week you can own, I don't know, let's call it a property worth $500,000. So you'd look at that and you'd go, geez, and this is obviously assuming a whole range of different things, whether it came to fruition or not, who knows. But for $50 a week, or even call it $100 a week, out of pocket, you can own a property. Regardless of what the property is, regardless where it is, just push all of that to the side. That's really appealing to people. So they'd look at it and go, yep, that'd make sense. Then you'd overlay the tax benefit of being negatively geared, and once again it depends on your marginal tax rate and how negatively geared you are, but then the idea and the concept, and this is where the appeal comes from. You get a $500,000 asset, say it doubles in 10 years, that asset is now worth $1 million. Say it doubles again in another 10 years. That asset is now worth $2 million. Now, let's just assume that our numbers of doubling every 10 years is wrong, so I'm going to halve that. Let's assume that in 20 years' time, your $500,000 asset has gone to $1 million. All else being equal, you've made $500,000 over a 20-year period, and it's cost you $50 or $100 out of pocket each week. Now, people don't add up everything else associated with it.
Yeah.
It's costing me $5,000 a year over a 20-year time frame. What does that equate to? They just see that, hey, I've gone from $500,000. That's $500,000 that they would never have ordinarily had or grown.
Yeah.
And I think that there is the appeal with all of this. And on the surface, that sounds great. That's like, financial magic. So people tend to flock to it. And that's the reason why I think it's been so easy for, in particular, people going to their accountants and saying, hey, I've got a tax problem. Yep, buy property.
Yeah.
And they're willing to sign on the dotted line for $500,000 worth of debt. Low interest rate environment given, but signing up and just doing it like it was, a purchasing decision like you'd go and buy a car. I was always fascinated by that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to look at, the overall strategy. So for some people, it makes sense to do it. I wouldn't specifically try to negatively gear a property. If it so happens that, you purchase a property that's got high growth prospects and it isn't going to receive as much in rental income, you get a tax benefit at the end of the day. It's, an investment vehicle for it to increase in value and sell it at a future point in time. Fantastic. But intentionally trying to drive down your own rent or intentionally trying to, increase your expenses on the property is just mind baffling to me. It's crazy. Yeah. And one of the other considerations sitting on the other side of the fence is positively geared properties. A positively geared property is a property where, in your example, it doesn't cost you $50 a week to own a property. You actually get $50 a week for owning a property. So, after all your expenses, after taking on the mortgage, after all of that stuff, you can look at, properties that actually pay you more than you actually pay in terms of your interest and all of your expenses on the property. Means that you're going to have to pay tax on it at the end of the day. But again, you're getting paid for the benefit in owning an asset that should be increasing in value as well. So there's certainly two sides to the equation. There's certainly, two aspects to it that you need to look at depending on what your overall situation is. But it's a very interesting concept to me when people, intentionally try to lose money and not do it as a content or not do it deliberately as a strategy, but rather, every day in terms of their expenses.
And that's the whole idea behind investments and passive income, right?
Yeah.
Like we talk about that all the time. You want your investments to give you passive income so you don't have to work or personal exertion in order to generate income. And over time, you'd like your financial capital to replace your working capital, and away you go.
Yeah, exactly right.
Andrew, in this instance, let's talk about who this would be relevant for. And from a planning perspective, what are some of the things that we'd put into place or talk to a client about and basically say, these are our must-haves if this is a strategy that you want to consider?
Yeah.
What would be some of those things?
So look, there's a few things. One, most important thing is cash flow.
Yep.
I think that's the cornerstone of any financial plan. That's really the building blocks. And if that's not there, then this is absolutely not a viable strategy. So making sure that there's sufficient cash flow in order to be able to account for not just the negatively geared aspect of a property now, but if your property is 10 grand a year negatively geared, an expense, you're talking about a property, there's a million things that could go wrong with a property. An added expense of $5 grand a year is pretty easy. Like, it doesn't take a lot for you to have to fork out an amount of money for such a large asset like that. So making sure that there's cash flow, making sure that there's cash flow buffers in order to be able to account for interest rate increases or any additional expenses on the property is just absolutely key.
So just on that, I'd go one step further with it and say, yes, income, 100%. So you're probably looking at the security of employment.
Yep.
What does that look like? What does a person do for a living? Is it a dual income household? If we're talking to a couple,
Yep. Commission,
bonuses, earning potential, in the event that something goes wrong in their particular organisation or the people that they work for, how easily would they be able to transfer across to a different employer? What does all of that look like? So trying to get an understanding of, in the event that something happens, what's the level of certainty that your income will continue reasonably quickly at approximately the same level of what you've been earning today?
Especially because for a property to be negatively geared, you're probably from a debt position quite high. So your LVRs are going to be quite high. Your debt to income ratio on the property is going to be quite high. So naturally, you're going to be taking on substantially more risk just by its very nature of being able to deploy this strategy. And so you have to make sure that there's some certainty in income.
Yep.
Like first year being self-employed, you don't know what the income's going to be. Probably not the right strategy for you.
So from that perspective, a cash management system I think is critical. And once again, you touched on that before, but just having that in place, because it allows you to optimize. In our experience, it allows you to optimize your financial position from an income versus an expense perspective. Having cash buffers, so that emergency fund, that safety net, that obviously makes a lot of sense from that perspective.
Yeah.
Using an example before, if you're negatively geared by $100 a week or cash flow, if your cash flow position is negative $100 a week with your property, that's $5,000 a year. Using the example in the situation that we're in now, from the bottom to where we are now with interest rates, that's added about $1,000 a month onto mortgage repayments. So if that's the case, $5,000 out of pocket plus another $1,000 a month, that's $17,000 negative cash flow that people would be in this position.
Yeah.
So that's really substantial.
It's massive.
So level of income is also critical, because you need to be able to make sure that you've got enough household income and enough surplus coming in to be able to compensate for that. Cash buffers in case anything goes wrong.
Yep. A really solid risk mitigation insurance strategy.
Yep.
So you consider your income protection covers, even for your family, your life insurances, your permanent disabilities, even trauma insurances. So making sure that there's a risk mitigation strategy if something were to happen to health. So aside from the things that you can control, is imperative. The higher your income tax bracket, the more beneficial the strategy is. So if you're claiming a tax deduction, naturally, as you're on a higher income tax bracket, you're also going to claim a higher benefit from a tax perspective as well. So really, you're more so looking at people that are on higher tax brackets for this strategy to be deployed well. The other thing is also appetite to risk. I mean,
took the words right out of my mouth.
It sounds all good, and it is all good so long as everything works out the way that you expect it to. But the amount of times that people go into something like this, and you consider their appetite to risk just doesn't even come close to what it should be for deploying a strategy like this. It's sometimes downplayed the level of risk that's involved in this. Because there's so many things that can happen, whether it's to your income, whether it's to the asset, whether it's to the property being untenanted for a while. Like, there's so many things that can impact the viability of this strategy, and whether you're forced in a position to sell. But appetite to risk is definitely something that needs to be there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we often talk about the sleep test. So if there's something that's keeping you up at night, if you can't sleep, metaphorically speaking, it's not the right strategy for you. But I'm always surprised at this, that it's like an unknown. Yeah. People just go into these things with blinkers on and I don't know if it's because they've been sold an idea, or they've, by a professional trying to sell, a professional salesperson trying to sell, some stock, or if it's, I've seen a family friend do it or whatever it may be. But Look, debt, especially at the moment, for the first time in a long time, if not handled correctly, can be quite dangerous.
Yeah.
And interest rates, using that example before, from a cash flow perspective, it doesn't take much to knock you completely off track. But I always found it really fascinating, coming back to my point, that, this sounds great. Sure, where do I sign? Happy to borrow another $500,000. Bang, away we go. Just crazy. And then if you're maximizing the strategy, interest only. So it's not like you're paying the debt down over a period of time. You're just, from a cash flow perspective, you're just basically servicing the interest.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The other probably, last thing that you need is time frame.
Yep.
If you've got, short time frame to retirement, and, you've heard that this is a great thing that you can get some tax benefit for in a short period of time, you really need to be holding an asset for a long period of time in order to be able to let capital growth do its work. I mean, you consider purchasing a property. Let's take, $1 million property. You're going to pay close to $60,000 worth of stamp duty. So for you to be able to make up that stamp duty, that initial cost of purchasing that asset, as well as justifying the exercise, paying for, capital gains tax, all of that stuff, you need to hold an asset for a long period of time. This is a long-term strategy. This isn't a strategy that you're going to deploy, get some tax benefit, sell the property in a year, and that's it.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, 100%. I think everything that we're saying probably points to what we usually talk about is getting advice.
Yeah.
And not wanting to fly our own flag. But honestly, that's it. That's the truth, right? It used to be a strategy that was a lot more, I think, accepting with the blinkers on, and a lot more flippant. People would be prepared to do it. But at the moment, you need to make sure that you've got your I's dotted and your T's crossed, because if you deploy this and you don't tick all the boxes, you could run into trouble pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Andrew,
rounded off perfectly.
That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
To our listeners and our viewers, thank you as always. If you've got any thoughts or you want to have a chat about your situation, reach out. Details are in the show notes, and we will catch you on the next one.
Thanks again.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature and it is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amaritis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Proprietary Limited, authorised representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.